I guarantee you, there is no school teaching critical race theory in like a public school. That is not happening. DEI has been around for a long time and under various names, and people got really interested in it as a political thing in 2020 with the George Floyd situation. Something happens in the news to a person that it shares some identity characteristics with you. It kind of pings them like a tuning fork. Like this could happen to me. And that's every group. That's every group feels that way. That's
Right.
part of human nature. If you are not part of that group and you're not feeling that ping, then what you say is going to set off pings in other people. One of the things that people misunderstand about DEI is like they're trying to shut people up. And it's like, no, we're trying to make people aware of what their words actually do.
I'm Andrew Shepard. This is the Converging Perspectives podcast. Kim, you have a background in dealing with polarization in America. This seems to be our problem right now. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your background with approaching a polarized mentality in our country?
I think that because just the nature of my own identity being mixed race and having a foot in multiple camps my whole life, I have always been attracted to the edge there of like, why are there different things happening? How can people interpret what's going on in the world in two completely different ways? And so the first time I think I started dealing with this was probably in the early 2000s when I found myself working for a nonprofit in Berkeley, where my job, as you can imagine, I'm doing a nonprofit in Berkeley. It's a pretty liberal place, but my job was to keep track of what conservatives thought and to see how they were thinking about our issue and where we might be able to make some inroads. That is actually what got me into social science in the first place. And from there, I went on and got a PhD in organizational psychology, in positive organizational psychology with a positive slant from Claremont Graduate University. And I've been working as a consultant on many organizational issues, ranging from just basic executive coach and team coach to working on a lot of DEI initiatives and with entertainment and tech companies and science companies all throughout California.
Interesting. So you've been working with DEI.
I've been working with DEI, but that has not been ever where I've put my main basket. My goal is human functioning in general, I wanted to make work less shitty for everybody. That's why I got into this business. But I have worked on a lot of DEI initiatives in large companies and in small companies, with some very successful, some not very successful. That has informed my perspective quite a lot.
Why don't we just jump right into that right now, like the DEI, because DEI is such a hot button topic being largely railroaded or destroyed by the Trump administration. What is DEI really? What are the advantages of it? And then how is it a problem at times?
DEI has been around for a long time and under various names, and people got really interested in it as a thing, as a political thing. I would say it kind of hit the big time in 2020 with the George Floyd situation. And it had been building for a while because George Floyd was obviously not the first Black person to be killed under suspicious circumstances by police. But that was the one that, with everybody home from COVID and everybody in kind of a big state of being glued to the news and a lot of doom scrolling, that really mobilized a lot of people and made people feel that this was something that they needed to work on. I'm not going to refresh you on the details of George Floyd. You can Google.
No. Yeah. No, I remember it myself quite clearly, and I remember watching the video, being somewhat traumatized watching the video. Like,
Yeah.
oh my God. I was just furious, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As were a lot of people. And so at that point, a lot of companies said, one of the key aspects, and, I don't want to say this, first of all, I'm just going to say, anything I say, you can twist it around. I don't think that. And so all words are a little loaded right now. So I'm hoping that when we're talking, you and anybody listening can give a little bit of grace to the exact words we're using, because right now because part of polarization is the idea that if you say this one word, then that implies a whole bunch of other associations about what you must therefore think. And I would like to not have that be part of our conversation.
Right. Because people's minds are basically preparing for, oh, if that word comes up, it's going to trigger me. And then I'm going to go into a full tribalistic response and deem you the enemy.
It's very much like that. And it's very much like that on both sides. There has been a lot of psychological study recently about sort of the idea that when something happens in the news to a person that is, shares some identity characteristics with you, and it's a bad random thing that is like terrifying, then people who also share that identity characteristic, it kind of pings them like a tuning fork. Like this could happen to me, which is why if you're, for example, a very established Jewish person in the United States and anything that's happening in Israel or people being upset with the state of Israel, for example, for what's going on, it just pings this thing and you're like, yes, but we must defend the Jews, and that's every group. That's every group feels that way. That's
Right.
human nature.
Tribalism built into the brain.
It's not really tribalism. I mean, I don't really know why this is because I don't think that when people say tribalism, we often think that that's like, oh, that's a bad thing that we could think ourselves,
No.
critically think our things out of. And this is not something that you can, it's
Right.
kind of,
We've survived. It's helped us survive for millennia, and it's identity protective cognition is another thing psychologists
identity
will call
protective.
it.
I mean, it is, but I don't
Anyway,
want to paint it as entirely a bad thing. That's what I want to
right,
say. It's
right.
the thing that is. And because one of the things in my work when it's been successful in DEI is helping people understand that if you are not part of that group and you're not feeling that ping, then what you say is going to set off pings in other people.
Yes.
Right. And so, because one of the things that people misunderstand about DEI is like they're trying to shut people up. And it's like, no, we're trying to make people aware of what their words actually do. That's all.
Let's get a little deeper into the genesis of DEI so we understand
And
why it came up in the first place.
the origin of critical race theory is it's not something that is ever taught I guarantee you, there is no school in teaching critical race theory in like a public school. That is not happening. Nobody is teaching critical race theory. And that is because critical race theory is a fairly arcane legal theory that is taught in law schools. So, as John Oliver said, unless your 5-year-old is getting a law degree, no one is teaching them critical race theory. And this again what critical race theory is an effort to figure out why, despite the Civil Rights Act of the 60s, differing outcomes for different racial groups still persist. And the idea is that it's kind of baked into our systems in a lot of ways. That things that happened before the Civil Rights Act are still having an effect now. Primary about this is that people talk about, it's like the redlining of the 20s and 30s. So that as the country was urbanizing and people were buying homes and creating homes in urban areas, there were areas that were redlined, meaning no Black people here. Or let's put all the Black people over here, for example. Those neighborhoods also were the first to get destroyed when there was a highway coming through. It was more expensive to get a mortgage. Rates that would work for a white person, people wouldn't do it for a Black person. And because of this, homeownership, which was like one of the greatest drivers of generational wealth, was not available to a lot of people. And that means then that people still in the 21st century have disparate amounts of family wealth, of home ownership, of the things that create the American dream. And so that's the kind of thing that critical race theory is meant to address. It's not telling you that any race is better than another. It's not telling you that you are wrong for being white. It's not trying to make anybody feel guilty about anything. If you're feeling guilty, that is your problem. And it's not helping, right?
Right.
Not
And
helping
that,
anybody for
yeah,
anybody.
and I always like to point that out too, that like Black people don't want your guilt. That's not helping them at all.
They do not. And so it is literally about how institutions go about things. It's literally not personal in any way. And and yet it has very few people on the right understand what critical race theory is. Most people that I've tried to talk to cannot give me any idea of this except for it's teaching white kids to feel guilty.
The way I understand it is that there's this sort of oversimplified idea that, well, racism is of the past. No one wants to return to slavery. That's over. So the Civil War has no impact on us today. Because that's so many generations over. And so you imagine, look, if we're all colorblind, if we're teaching colorblindness, then our children and our children's children will just erase racism altogether. But obviously, that's not happened.
It hasn't happened. And, when I grew up in the 70s, I was growing up in the 70s, and that really was the dominant idea of let's just sort of teach them colorblindness. Let's just make, Black just another thing, right? Like being Armenian or being, I don't know, something that where we don't, I mean, I'm here in LA, I think Armenian, but I grew up in Cleveland, right? So let's just think Polish. Nobody really minds. We make fun of them. They make fun of themselves. It's fine. And
Right.
that was kind of the idea in the 70s. And that didn't really work out. And it's because of these things that are still baked in. And because honestly, I want to talk about what it means to be racist at this moment, right? Because if you grow up in a racist society, yeah, you're kind of racist. And I'm racist, everybody's racist. Everybody's racist a little bit. And so I don't really think it helps when people go around saying, oh, this is racist or they're racist or don't be racist. You're not going
It's
to
almost
not be
it's meaningless language if the
meaningless.
entire culture basically sows a bit of racism into it. You can't
It just
escape that.
does. And so it's kind of like, getting mad at people for having a nose, of course.
It's not to say, and it's not to say that the US is worse than other countries either, because in many ways it's better. It's just not good enough because it's still harming people.
We announced this whole thing about let's make everybody equal, and then it's taken a while to kind of get there, at least in a legal sense, and now we're still struggling with that. So, and it's tough. And other countries have different approaches to this. This is in some ways very local, like most things about about societies. What I often say, one of human superpowers is coming up with ways of explaining the world that work perfectly for local conditions, and then thinking that that is like a mandate from God or whatever, that convincing ourselves that this is the one true way is what works locally.
I, I think about the stereotyping function, which is formally one of the cognitive biases, as sort of the basis of most racism. Like it's like there are other factors going on, of course, but it's built into our brains to make an initial stereotype to go, oh, well, that's what those people are like. And it's supposed to help the brain like figure out reality, right?
We have heuristics. I mean, that's how we do with everything,
Yeah.
right? We want rules of thumb for everything, right? So like when I Google, I was trying to turn a voicemail into a ringtone, and I'm like, I don't want to hear the background of how this all works. Just tell me the steps to do, right? That's a heuristic right now, right? These are the 5 things I need to know. And we do that with everything because that is so much, because it would be so cognitively overwhelming to not. So we do heuristics on everything. And so that means that I see a person with blonde hair and I make assumptions. And I see a person with
It's natural, it's not bad,
it's
but
how we operate. But you have to rein it in a little bit because you can, as with all heuristics, the map is not the territory, right? The
yeah,
stereotype is not the person. It's way more complicated than that. We have way more in common. People say race is a social construct. That doesn't mean it's not real in some ways, right? Because it's real because we make it real.
right.
But the scientific line is there's more variation within any so-called race group than there is between race groups. So that means that, I'm a Black person and but I look very different than a lot of Black people. That's variation within a group. And that there's more variation within any given group. Like if you actually look at like at genes, at phenotype, which is how your, hair and skin is, all of these at socioeconomic status, there's so much variation within a group that once you start to analyze it scientifically, you can't even say this is a group anymore. And
Right.
yet we all kind of know.
And that's still just dealing with like biology, not even talking about ideology, which is how most people align with a
Yeah,
religion or
absolutely.
politics, right?
Absolutely. And I'm talking about Black law because that's something that I know and I'm aware of. You can say this with any groups, and all groups have their own history of their identities sliding around and having different aspects be highlighted. If I can just say, we're in a moment right now where there's a lot of cultural cachet to being Black. That was not the case 30 years ago, right?
Right.
So we talk about like all of our famous musicians and everything, and it's a very, hip hop. It's a very there's a lot of cultural cachet from Black culture right now, and when MTV was first getting started, they refused to play Black artists, and that's during my lifetime,
Right.
right? So that was keeping the cultural cachet again, and also post Civil Rights Act, right? And the thing with getting back to DEI and critical race theory is that just talking about this, if you ignore this, it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away on its own. And also, people have experiences about this. To not talk about it means silencing a whole bunch of people and talking about what's actually happening that is making a difference in their lives.
Right.
Nobody is suggesting that one should go believe critical race theory. right? This is not like an ideology. This is not a religion. It's more like, we need some words to talk about things that actually happen in our lives that we notice and that
Right.
part of how we go about things.
There's not a set ideological mindset that they're trying to graft onto human beings and go, now you see it the way I do. It's more about becoming aware of things you might not be aware of, which will then inform to some degree how you see the world in a more complex
Exactly.
way.
Exactly, exactly. And the part that is hard about that, and this is where I'm going to say some of the part with DEI that I have not agreed with, is that a lot of times it's the way I see activists going about this. And again, I don't want to cast any aspersions on activists because I am not an activist. And if we really want people to deal with each other as human beings and not as political categories or stereotypes or groups, which is a totally different thing, right? We have to understand how human beings operate. And there's going to be, a wide difference between a person who is an activist as their personality, is their way of being in the world, and an average person, right? Because an activist wants to go around rattling the cages and making sure, right? Average person just wants to get through the day and make everything cool, right? For themselves. And as a person who's been involved in a lot of organizational change initiatives, there's kind of some principles that you do when you're trying to make change in a large organization. And generally, I find that taking an activist approach to DEI goes the exact opposite of all of that. Basically, does the exact opposite of things you would do if you were really trying to change an organization. And so what I've done in my work when it's been successful, when I've been able to make it successful, is to really apply principles of organizational change rather than a political approach.
What does that look like?
I can think of two really successful ones, and I'll tell you a little story about
Okay.
that. Okay. One was an internet marketing company that I was working with, and they had had some incidents of sexism, of like very clear sexism, and they were trying to do some sort of damage control. So we thought, we're going to help them like clean up their language and make it less of a boys club and all of this. And it's like, that's definitely not what was going to happen. First of all, because people they want to, people want to work in the way they want to work. They're not going to change their personalities. Right. But they did have like an actual strategic reason for this, which was most of their clientele and their customer base was female. And so if they only had men at the top, they knew they were going to miss a bunch of stuff because they had all female workers at the bottom and all men at the top. So they did it really quickly. They just said, okay, here's a list of 50-minute women. Let's promote them.
Very manly way of solving the problem,
It,
doesn't it?
it was a very, dominator culture way of doing it. Let's just give people more power, right? So but it wasn't just within the company. They realized that because they, just like the film model in LA, which has networks of freelancers that are working with them all the time, and that's how half the work is getting done, external to the company, right? They realized that they had a lot of people they were working with and really relying on, and they were women, and they were in these freelance positions rather than being internal to the company. And so they made them new deals, and they gave them more power, and they gave them different titles and things that were like the symbols of power as well. And I really want to applaud them for looking outside, because it came from them, not from me, but figuring out that part of it was that these people were working outside the company hierarchy and therefore not getting the voice that they needed. And they
To
were
influence the operations of the company in a
that
better
was
way.
they did that. And so they just did that. And I really want to applaud them for doing that, because, what a lot of people would do is just, I don't know, we'll promote a couple of women and hopefully that'll take care of it. Maybe we'll get a woman on the board. Sure.
Right.
Okay. Right. That's not going to create change. You need large numbers of people. And that was in pretty short order that started to change the company. Now, did the people in charge stop talking derogatorily about women? Not in the slightest. But on the other hand, they made real equity changes that were strategic and that were really going to help the company, and that were really going to help the women. That was
Right. You didn't fire all the management in
We
order to
didn't fire the
solve the
management.
problem.
Nobody had to go to like how to be a nicer person classes.
Right. Because I feel like people view DEI from the outside in this fearful way of like, oh my God, it's like a brainwashing system. It's like taking, like Christians taking
Can't
people
say
to gay people and like, oh, we're gonna recondition you.
yeah, you can't say X anymore. And a lot of people that's what they really want, but that doesn't help anybody, right? And here's the thing about that I find about DEI. This is where it drives me crazy. People focus on the words a lot. And they also critical race theory describes kind of a social hierarchy one of the things that academic theories like that are great at, they're great at describing reality. They are terrible for telling you what to do about reality. So the fact that critical race theory says, yeah, it seems like kind of white people are on top, and then there's this kind of hierarchy, and the lower you are in the hierarchy, the less you get to talk. So the thing is, what people do with that though is that then they say, okay, well let's just let the people on the bottom talk, and we'll stand aside. And that's what a lot of the activists say we should do. Is like if you're not in the group, maybe shut up, and that would be great. But no one wants to be told to shut up. Nobody wants to be told, we don't care what you think about this. This is our part. Like, this is your problem to solve, but we want you to shut up about it. No, that is never going to happen. Nobody's going to go for that. And so that to me is partly why a lot of these initiatives have foundered, is because it's telling white people there's no place in this except for you to listen and learn and shut up. And it's not
Well,
nobody's.
it doesn't help with the social group either, because you tell people to shut up, it causes disengagement and resistance
Yeah,
to what you're trying to implement. So you're literally creating enemies that otherwise might have been actively going, oh, well, I think that. And if you ask them like Socratic questions, they might actually start to change while engaging with you and go,
right.
wow, this is more complicated than I realized. And I'm really liking this new perspective. And then they could have been the most active leaders in the initiative changes.
I'm just going to say, the activist types, they really don't want that. They really don't want that. They really don't want that. They don't want to engage. I mean, they don't want the white people to have to take over, because that's what would happen.
Is that reverse racism or is it just laziness?
I'm not willing to say it's either, but I'm going to say that this is why there has to be a Big Ten, and it can't just be the activist way or no way.
Right.
Right. There's got to be a bunch of ways to work on this, or else it's not going to work. Because, honestly, I'm too light skinned to talk about this in a lot of ways. Right. For a
Mm.
lot of people, I would be like, who's this white girl talking about this? Right. And, and once you start going down that road, I mean, these are real feelings that people have, but it doesn't help really. It doesn't help if you want to get people on board. And that's where I say that the way we've been doing DEI doesn't really help make the mass change that we would need. And I understand where they're coming from completely. But also a lot of times, like, I was in book groups, right? I had to do a lot of learning myself. I was in book groups in 2020 to work through, how to be anti-racist and all that stuff, so I can understand all of this. And it makes like many things, it makes a certain amount of consistent sense when you're in it, but then you take it out to the real world and it doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, I don't want to speak derogatorily about this, my experience either, but I did a racism facilitation course in Berkeley, and it was really beautiful and meaningful, and people were crying all the time, and it was cool, but it felt very insular, like a small microculture of people who all get it. And I felt unwelcome because I was the only white man there. I felt very
Everybody's
much like
looking at
I
you.
was being projected upon as the enemy, and almost making people feel less safe because I was there, even though I'd done a lot of research already on
Everybody's
racism.
ready to fuck up. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. That's the reason why I think the emphasis on language on this is just so misplaced. I mean, but this is not, I find the emphasis of renaming everything. I mean, I get it. It would be great to not have, reminders of slavery everywhere, but that's not what's holding people back. That's not the problem. That's a symptom. That's not the problem,
Right.
right? Our culture, I think right now, when we're talking about polarization, a lot of it comes from media, and a lot of media comes from consumerism. We are really taught to create our identities around our things and our purchases and our allegiances. People who are like this, like Coke, and the people who are like this, like Pepsi. And then we make all kinds of other assumptions and all this made up stuff around that. And I don't think it's just race. I think it's just how we are manipulated in a consumer culture to divide ourselves into teams.
Right. Right. It's conditioning. It reminds me of, this almost sounds like I'm going to say something wrong, but like the idea of just sampling from things that you consume rather than creating Like, oh,
And
I'm really good at creating playlists, but I don't write any music anymore.
yeah, consuming rather than creating, and also not seeing the things that we do have in common because there's no juice in that. That will not play on social media. Our alignment is boring. So finding our differences is really exciting. That's just a tension in, human social interaction. Here's my cat wanting
Some social interaction. That was perfect timing.
but I mean, so much of our conditioning is to see the conflicts because that's where the drama and the interest is. And I think a lot of that is kind of groomed from media from our entire lives.
The highly social person at the office that people are like, you just need to shut up now. You just be quiet and hear the more minority voices in the room. Like this reminds me exactly of this psychological study that I read about, which was about bullying. When they tried to implement the no bullying policy, it was catastrophically bad. It was catastrophically bad for zero tolerance bullying because what it turns out when they really studied the kids over time, they realized that the kids who were becoming bullies in school, grade school, they were the quickest to develop socially. And
Mm.
so that why if when they really did a full study of them throughout the whole school day, they realized these kids were simultaneously the most bullying of other kids and the most pro-social of other kids too. They were building other kids up
Oh.
too. So it's like it wasn't that they were bad kids. It's that they just had reached that social development in their brains earlier than everybody else, and they'd become dominant. They'd become the leaders. And so they were both creating, shaming kids for not fitting in and rewarding kids for fitting in. It's sort of a tribalistic kind of mentality. And I feel like that probably applies to adults as well. That if you have just a very talented social person in the work office who's probably in upper management because of their skills, getting that person on board with the DEI program is the best bang for your buck you're going to get.
Yeah, I mean, in organizational change, you often talk about, there's champions and there's cynics and then there's fence sitters, right? There's going to be a few champions, people who are really into what you're doing. They're the ones you got to cultivate and feed and give all the resources to because they're the ones who are going to get it done. But your temptation when you're trying to make organizational change is to spend all your time with the cynics, the people who are saying no, 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 because you want to fight them, right? But
Mhm.
that's not going to help, really. And then most people, like 80% of the world, is fence sitter, right? They don't care. Just tell me what we're doing and we'll go along with it. That's also, I think, relevant for politics, and people often, I think, underestimate the amount of juice there is in just people saying, I don't know, let me know what we're doing and I'll go along with it, right?
It's such a good
Um,
point. Just as a quick tangent, that's such a good point about politics because that seems to be what people online in particular are doing all the time is they're arguing with people with exactly the opposite viewpoint on this particular issue instead of
right.
looking
And
for
that's
inroads for
fine.
building a dialogue about what we agree about and how we can
Yeah,
solve problems.
exactly. And it's fun. And I get into that too. I had to reinstitute my rule of I'm allowed to argue online with friends, but not with friends of friends.
Yeah,
Like
nice.
if
I
we
like that.
already have a little alignment, then I can argue with them. But if you are just some person on somebody else's feed saying stuff that I don't agree with, I should not say anything. That's my
My
rule.
My rule is as soon as it gets to ad hominem, it needs to end
Ah,
or it turns into a personal conversation on the phone. That's the rule I try to make.
yes, and actually, I want to point that out. I want to underline what you just said, which is turn to a conversation on the phone. That's where it should go because we're so used to online conversation. But to take a life's worth of experience and compress it into a couple bullet points and expect somebody to actually read that and understand something, that's never going to happen. If we had different views and we sit down to dinner and we talk for a couple of hours, then we'll both leave a little changed. We won't necessarily have changed our mind about the issue, but we will have had a community experience where we will understand things not just cognitively, rationally, like the argument, but also from a more heart centered place. And that's part of the fact that we don't do that and we just go blah, 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 bullet point online,
Yeah.
trying to turn up the volume all the time is part of why we're so polarized right now.
Yeah. And I just want to add that I think it was in the 90s, a research study was done that pretty much proved that you're getting less than 7% of the information when you're in a text exchange, even an email. You're getting less than
Oh, yeah.
7% of the communication if you were in the same room with that person talking.
Oh,
It's
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. There's no way. There's
huge.
no way. And I really important to me that those skills don't. we could lose a lot of those skills in a generation or two if we aren't careful. And I really think it's important that we have to double down in these weird times on our in-person skills for connecting, because that's what's going to help save us, I think.
Totally, totally. Now, if you need any more reinforcement on that point, see a Key and Peele episode in which they illustrate a text conversation between two guys who are completely thinking different things via all of the messages. One guy finally gets so angry about all the texts that he gets.
I
They sh
love this one so much. That's one where
yeah.
one of them is a bunch of coffee, the other one is smoking a lot of dope, and they're in completely different places and misinterpreting each other. It's so perfect.
He's
So
like, yeah,
perfect. I love
okay,
that one.
whatever. And the other's like, whatever? How dare you, you son of a bitch? Like, fine, I don't care either. It's like, cool, well, we'll just meet up then. And he's like, yeah, we'll meet up. And then he shows up with like a board with nails in it, like ready to fight. And the
Oh,
guy's like,
right.
hey, buddy, I got a beer here for you. And he hides the stigma and he's like, oh, I misinterpreted this.
So perfect. I want to tell you a story from 20 years ago since we talked about polarization. This is a real story. I've been telling the story for 20 years, probably 25 now. When in the early 2000s, as I mentioned, I was living in Berkeley. I was working for this nonprofit, and I was also a skater. I was a pro inline speed skater at the time, and that was kind of my main thing. I was working part time in this other thing. And during that time, it was kind of hard to find people to date. I could really only date cyclists. I can't date other skaters. It's like dating at the office, right? You're going to see them all. Is not a good idea. So I could really only date cyclists. But I'm a pretty literate person. I wanted to date literate cyclists. So when I found literate cyclists, then I'm like, yes, okay, we're going to date. And so I had been dating a guy who lived in Marin, who described himself as, well, I might be the most conservative guy in Marin County, but I'm the most liberal guy from where I'm from in Nebraska. And let's call and at the time, I was also living in a women's co-op in Berkeley. So imagine those politics, right?
Mm.
They are conservative. And the head of our household, Amy, had no love lost for Bob whatsoever. This was not going to work out for her. So one day after a ride, we were sitting in my kitchen, and a third roommate comes in carrying this huge batch of strawberries. She's just come from the farmer's market. They're gorgeous. And simultaneously, Bob and Amy point at her and say, you better wash those. And then they look at each other because this is the first time they've ever agreed on anything ever. And Amy says, yeah, because you don't know what kind of chemicals the companies might have been putting on those. And Bob says, no, because the workers pee in the bushes. Is that not amazing as far as the different viewpoints? And I always love telling that story because sometimes it used to go over really big. And now, we're all a little bit triggered by like the other side and, on our side that it doesn't, it's harder to get a laugh out of that story because people take their sides very seriously these days.
Yeah. But it's like the answer is we're washing the fruit. It doesn't matter
Still
why.
watching the fruit.
And it's like we're trying to get rid of corruption. It doesn't matter why.
But that kind of thing has, I mean, there's if you're a person under 35, I think it would be really hard for you to understand how far it has gone compared to how it used to be in terms of political polarization.
Yeah, well, I feel like I can tell it already. I mean, my dad was married to a conservative while I was growing up, and that was not like the cause of most conflict in the household. I mean, there were other conflicts, but that was not the root of it. They both saw themselves as sort of a little out of the box, maybe, and they both voted for Ross Perot, and Ross Perot, it's like yeah, they could both go third party, on that one. But today, these same people are extremely far on the left and right, and I still communicate with them and am sort of blown away by both of them from time to time by just how extremely one directional their thought is.
Right, exactly.
To me, DEI seems like we're just talking about expanding people's viewpoints. It's not about, oh, we're going to shame you, we're going to guilt you with all this information. The positive side of it, if it was done well, would be that you expand your perception of things. Because if you're feeling fear or shame, that really is shutting down the mind and putting you into a defense mechanism reaction, which is a very, very poor way to learn anything, right? It's like you could create trauma by a fear reaction, but you can't create actual expansion of understanding. Oh, my perspective has grown here. Now I see things differently.
Yeah,
And
and that's really what you that's ideal, but you don't even need to have that in order to make things a little bit better for everybody, you know? I mean, I think a lot of DEI focuses on your individual empathy and expansion. And I know that the learning I've done has absolutely been a boon and a bonus for me. It's been life-changing to understand that the perspective that I grew up in as a person with a white mom and a black dad, having both of those perspectives, it's the world's just much bigger than all of that, and that's been really juicy for me to see all of the different things that go in there. And of course, I want that experience for other people, but not everybody's going to have an attachment to that. And so another initiative that I worked on, we didn't get into any of the emotional stuff at all. What we did instead was I was like, look, here's how to have a conversation with people when you're going to hear some stuff that you don't like. And that's because like this is another organization I was working with where they were starting to get into having some, public spats over DEI stuff. This was not good. And I said, okay, we're just going to work on having difficult conversations where you hear some criticism of what you're doing and you don't freak out and you don't cry and you don't run away. That's all. Right.
Mm.
So we literally worked on our skills of just not freaking out and crying and running away about anything. Right. Could be anything. Right. And that really ended up being a huge linchpin for getting change made. And this organization has transformed as a result of this. But it was never about here's what Black people think, or here's the history of Chinese people in America, or here's why you should have empathy for this, that, or the other thing, or here's why you should give more resources to these people. None of that. It was just here's how to hear things and talk about things that make you uncomfortable. And then they figured it out on their own, right?
Yeah, that seems like a good training for anybody today.
Because everybody wanted to do the right thing. Nobody wants to be, continually racist, but also nobody wants to be continually criticized, right?
Right.
So, you figure this out. This is not
Is
rocket science.
If we're trying to hold on to the sort of extremes of this issue, is there another extreme where would you see the negative viewpoint towards DEI? Do you see why people are so afraid or
Oh,
hateful
absolutely.
around it?
I'll
And what
tell
is the basis of that?
you. I was talking to my best friend from high school, who is a white person, and it's also my best friend for 40 years here. They had DEI initiatives at work, and she hated it. And she was just like, let me out of this. This is terrible. And it's not because she's a racist any more than anybody, right? But it's because they were saying, well, how would you feel if you had these things happening? And they're like, but I've had other different things happening in my life that also sucked.
So those are the wrong questions, right? Because they could literally just ask you, have you ever, this is what they did in my training, which I really liked. Loved this question. Have you ever felt like you couldn't bring parts of yourself to work? It's a universal, everyone had an answer for that. I had an answer for that. It's like everyone can relate to that and go, oh man. And then you hear someone else's story and you're like, wow, I see what's going on here. That's
Yeah.
intense.
Especially at work, you really can't legislate empathy for people. And you don't,
Mm,
and I hate to say this as a psychologist, this is a weird thing to say, but you don't need it, right? Especially
mm.
in our company, right? In our current corporate milieu, everything is very transactional, right? So I think of it kind of like the internet marketing company I was telling you about. These guys don't have to stop making derogatory comments about women. I mean, we'd love it if they would, but they're not gonna. They just have to get the structures right. And that's really what critical race theory is about. It's not about how you feel, it's not about how you think about yourself, it's not about what groups you have allegiance to, it's not about replacing anybody, right? It's just about getting getting the systems so that they aren't constantly rewarding these people and punching these people. That's
Okay. I mean, that sounds totally defensible and awesome. Trying to get people to empathize, sort of
oh yeah.
get people to feel shame, essentially.
Well, yeah, to empathize. I mean, I think shame comes out of that. I mean, I don't. I just want to say right now, I don't want one white person to feel guilty about anything, right? Because when you say you didn't do it, largely you didn't. This is a historical thing, but again, just kind of like all the trauma that's done to everybody, right? Everybody's got trauma in their life. Maybe you didn't create these circumstances, but it's still up to you to figure out how to live with them and to keep your trauma from hurting other people, right? So it's the same thing. We didn't create this. Nobody's saying you did, but you still got to deal with what's here.
And this takes us right into dominator culture, like Riane Eisler's work on we don't just have a patriarchy. It's bigger than that. It's a dominator culture that really makes everybody suffer.
Makes everybody suffer. And you know who suffers from patriarchy the most is men, honestly. Men. So I like the term dominator culture better because I was really into that for a long time. I was a sports person and I was raised in a way where there was a lot of fear around if you aren't a predator, you are prey. That was not great for me. In fact, that was terrible for me in every way. In fact, most of my adult life has been to unlearn and undo that.
Well, how was that terrible, and how was that? Because you must have liked it at the time, right? Like,
Oh,
you felt like you were succeeding at the time, being a
absolutely.
dominant person.
I absolutely did. And especially during my sports years, I absolutely lived by that. I was like, I'm the baddest ass in the room. I'll do what I want. Thank you.
And that's sort of what corporate America rewards. They're like, oh, there's a badass. I want that person working for me. We'll make more money.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And yet that doesn't really get borne out in how things really are. I mean, it feels great. I love walking around with a lot of swagger. Swagger's fun. And it's certainly better than feeling like everybody's out to get you, which is partly how I got into that. I got bullied a lot as a kid. And so later when I, found a sport that I was really good at and could get really strong and do anything, that felt great. That felt like the hero's journey reversal that you were hoping for. Loved it. But then I caused a lot of damage. I was mean to a lot of people. I did what was done to me. That was not great. I threw my weight around. I did all the things you're supposed to do. It was not great. And it didn't ultimately didn't get me what I wanted, because what I wanted, for example, was to be like I wanted to be loved. I also wanted to be a creative person. When I went to graduate school, my master's thesis was on flow experiences in competitive situations. The basic line at that point was that athletes didn't experience as much flow, peak experience in competitive situations because they were worried about winning, trying to engineer an outcome. And therefore, you couldn't really be in the moment. You couldn't really be having this lack of self-consciousness, this beautiful merging of action and awareness that is a flow experience, right? And I was like, I don't think that's really true, because and I think it might have to do with what you think you're doing here in competition. And so my work demonstrated that if you thought that you were here to if the other people trying to get there first was part of the challenge and you were all just kind of in it together trying to do this thing, you would experience more flow than if you were trying to demonstrate that you were the best person out here. Then you wouldn't have flow. And so that turned out to be the case. So that, yes, people who were trying to demonstrate dominance didn't have flow in competitive situations, but people who were kind of like, well, this is an interesting way of making it even more challenging, difficult for my skills. They did. And they weren't out to get anybody. They were just trying to do a thing over here.
Have you seen the movie The Challengers that came out last year?
I think so.
Starring Zendaya and a few others. And it's so this, like, it's all about dominating and winning, you think.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in the end, you can tell it's all about the game. It's all about just being in play.
Yeah. Yeah. Being in play. And I think that's kind of a piece of, like, when we're talking about Riane Eisler and the dominator versus partnership culture, that the play is important. Because of my master's thesis, I was trying to extend that to a work setting for my dissertation for my PhD. And so I was trying to study competitive experiences in the workplace. And to my utter horror, I absolutely could not get any data that would convince my advisors that there were ever any positive competitive experiences in the workplace. I was so certain of this because I knew executives and I knew people who really enjoyed that dominator game so much. And I knew what it was like to do that in sports. I didn't really know what it was like to do that in a work setting, because that had not been my experience. Even though I had played that in a work setting, I was still kind of tense a lot of the time. And my advisors were like, well, show me some data and I'll support it. I would, no matter what kind of data I would get them, they would be like, no, this is not positive. No, this is not positive. And so finally I ended up scrapping the project. But what ended up happening was I realized that when it's work, when there's resources on the line, it's not a game anymore. It's war, because we're talking about, will I feed my family? Can I get health insurance? Can I get the basic things I need to live? And so I think a lot of people who enjoy competitiveness and enjoy the drama around competitiveness in sports think that that works in all situations. I know I did. I thought that you just bring that game in and that's how this is going to go. That is not how it goes, because when your real livelihood is on the line, it's no longer a game. The playfulness goes away and it's war, and that's not fun for anybody.
So this research sort of screws with the classic Adam Smith mythology of competition is the driving force of the workplace. And obviously there's some aspects to economics where it's like, having competition creates innovation in products. But with into competition as actually just causing a lot more cortisol to be bursting in people's brains and making them stressed out.
Stressed out, and makes them cut people out and do a lot of things that we know are not what make for a
Right.
good team, or and certain and arguably for good products. Adam Smith was not 100% pro competition. He named the forces competition, but that does not mean that he was into having a competitive attitude. His original works were very much about time and place. And also keep in mind, this is a time when a corporation was what we would now call a public benefit corporation. The whole point of a corporation was to do a thing for their community that individuals could not do on their own. I mean, that's what it was in Adam Smith's time. Right. And our understanding of what a corporation is, it has morphed a lot, and it's been only in the mid to late 20th century that people have determined that or decided, and again, it's a decision, it was not baked in, that a corporation is there to create value for shareholders alone. That was never part of the original.
Right. And that makes it a money grubbing, psychopathic institution by its nature. And it would have to have very ethical people managing it to make it not psychopathic.
Exactly. I just want to say those are all social decisions made over time. There's nothing inherent that means it has to be there.
Right. And it's unnatural if you think about human civilization over the millennia, tribal society in particular. That's a very destructive thing for a tribal society. It could literally hurt and kill everybody.
There's a lot of really great scholarship talking about how, if you think that the current world situation of giant nations of people is inevitable, you are wrong, because there have been so many. Because what humans do is they experiment with a lot of things, right? And there's always the same tensions in creating civilization of like, well, we have to rein in the sociopaths, and we have to help each other because there's stuff we need that we can't do alone. And there's so many different ways of solving that. There's so many different ways of making that not suck for people. Our current situation is hardly inevitable.
Nice. So Rian Eisler talks about the partnership culture as an opposition to a dominator culture, where first of all, men and women are co-creative and working together instead of having a hierarchical system. But also that's sort of the gift of the feminine in a lot of cultures, is this more circular approach to organization of human beings where everyone's sort of at an equal level of voice and power within reason, and people take turns being the leader. And different things
Right.
based on their skill set.
I don't know if we've ever talked about tend and befriend. Do you know about this?
No.
Oh, I'm going to tell you, sit back, because this is going to take a second, though, that it's important. So in the 90s, a bunch of grad students noticed that all of the basic research from the 50s that established that our basic way of dealing with threat was fight or flight, right? We've all heard fight or flight. They realized that all of those experiments that established that, whether it was in humans or primates or other animals or whatever, they're all done with male beings. And of course, this was very common in the mid-century because we really had practically zero computing power. So everything has to be really simple. So they didn't want women's cycles messing it up. So they only, like half of the stuff that we know in social psychology was only done with men. and college students, but that's a whole other issue. Let's not go with that.
The problems with academic research.
But the idea is you update, and so we needed kind of an update, right? So these guys said, let's update this. So they ran the exact same experiments, and they did it only with female beings. And they discovered that the patterns that emerged were not fight or flight. They were what they called tend and befriend. And that was because under threat, a female being would say, well, I probably can't fight them because I'm probably not going to win this threat, right? But even if I do and risk it, maybe I can run and get away, maybe I can win. But what happens to the kids I'm looking after? What happens to the old people I'm looking after? This is no good. So what women do is they band together. And the way they band together is by not establishing hierarchy, by feeding each other, and sort of metaphorically and physically to keep us all on the same page so we have strong bonds so that if something happens to me, you're going to take care of my people. And this is really important because this also has a lot of application in the workplace, frankly, because it has been shown that, women both are and are expected to be more communal leaders where we're thinking about what do we need, not just what do I need. And also, it's been shown in negotiation studies a lot that women don't tend to negotiate for themselves very well when they have to negotiate on behalf of somebody else or make sure that their family has what they need, or for some other people that are, for the group, they are just as effective as men and sometimes more.
This is fascinating. It also sounds like it would apply to a more long-term, like time scale,
Yeah.
that feminine approach to negotiation would also be better because if I die, my group is still being served by the agreements that I set up.
Yeah, exactly. And this is not exclusive to women. Men can use this, but because it very much comes out of a feminine nervous system, that this is what we do because we are responsible for the lives of others. As a young person, I was trying very hard not to ever be responsible for the lives of others, and yet here I am, right?
Well, it makes me think about what I've heard about the idea of the alpha male, which of course we can tear that apart in academia pretty well. But still, in some species, there is clearly an alpha male that's
Yeah,
dominant. But in the human species, at the very least, the alpha male that we talk about is actually the most responsible person in the room.
yeah.
They are taking responsibility for everybody. They're not an asshole.
Yes, they're not just throwing their weight around all the time, which is how people like to think about it. Because again, swagger feels great, but swagger is very ineffective.
Right. What are we talking about when this dominator culture is a recipe for traumatized people who, because they are feeling dominated and therefore insecure as a human being, they have a tendency towards narcissism, which is not about someone who is really high on themselves and who they are. It's
Yeah,
somebody who feels so fearful and shameful and self-hating, in fact, that their natural brain response is to create a false sense of self that is basically a perfected self-image that they then try to spread around, make people believe in this false image of self, which is while they're still in constant pain, they are basically dominating the world with their false projected self. That's a full-scale narcissist. And
yeah,
we don't want to champion that. We don't want to go, oh, that's the person we want in charge, because that person literally not only has no empathy, which means that they don't really care about you. And if they find it more politically expedient to just sideline you, they will. It's more that they're damaging people unconsciously all the time and spreading their illness.
yeah, exactly, exactly, exactly.
And so this, obviously a partnership culture or some other form of relating would be much better than the dominator culture that we're used to. But like the dominator culture seems to have been the most dominant form of cultural since the horse warriors 10,000 years ago, right? It's like first technology allowed people to get out of a more socialistic approach to human organization. And they're like, oh, if I can be a king, I want to be a king. It's like, and I feel that impulse too. I'm like, oh, if I could be really powerful and wealthy and have four, five, 10, 100,000 wives, I would, why not? But
Ego.
it's the ego, right? The ego was it. And that may sound great in the fantasy. And then when reality starts to break it down, I might go, oh, this is not what I thought it was.
Yeah, that's the thing. And, one of the things that really changed for me in getting out of the dominator culture was I couldn't do creative work because I was so invested in my perfect little mask of my projected self. And that self was not the one that did creative work. So in my journey, my desire to do creative work and to have experience real connection is what made me have to give that up. How we do this as a society, though, I don't really know. I wish I did. I wish I had an answer. I wish I had a magic bullet, but I feel like this is what we have to figure out. I do want to point out that partnership culture has never gone away. It's just not always what attracts the attention. In thinking about competition, as I spent so much time thinking about this, the gladiator shit is just the top of a pyramid, right? It's the bit of the iceberg that sticks up. And then there's all this cooperation and alignment underneath the surface that makes this possible, this like really exciting, swaggery drama piece, right? And we have to remember that that's not all there is. There's all this partnership culture that is going on at other levels. And it's just like most things that are associated with the feminine, just not quite as visible, not quite as out there.
Can hear voices in my head saying, "Oh, just chop the head off. Just take the head of the pyramid off." And of course, that's not good.
Well, it's not
Be-
going to work because there's always going to be, it will always be with us. It will always be with us, just as partnership culture will always be with us. I'm hoping that we can get to a place where people can see that that impulse for domination is what has to get reined in. John Dewey, I've been thinking about this quote a lot. Democracy has to be discovered in every generation. And so I think that there's, a lot of wisdom in the partnership culture that I'm hoping that we can kind of get back toward. And I think whether we do it intentionally and consciously with our heads up, or whether we wait for us to mostly blow ourselves up and then we have to not do it that way again.
I mean, that's what this highly polarized time is. Donald Trump is this catalyst for our growth because as much as he leans in a more dominator culture way,
Yeah.
which people are familiar with, which is why they probably feel good about it in some
Yeah, they
ways.
love it. They love it.
It's also pushing the pendulum in one direction for it to hopefully swing back in the other direction. Obviously, we don't want just lots of pendulum swinging.
And we just understand we're never going to stamp out either side, just as they're not going to stamp out,
Yeah.
whoever they is, right? What the stuff we're talking about here is so much part of the human condition that it's the tension that is always moving back and forth like this.
Right.
Our wisdom would be to figure out how to create stability even under those circumstances.
There's got to be a way to approach this that is less reactive and
Yeah.
less fear driven, less I need to control this outcome, but not I'm a fence sitter who doesn't give a shit about this. Because I have friends who, who are literally like, why are you watching all this politics? It's so negative. It's it's destroying your mind. I'm like, yeah. And other people like, I can't believe you're not watching the politics. Do you realize the world's falling apart? But let me propose my idea. And this related to the DEI and racism and everything too. It's like when you're dealing with something that's really complicated and you don't really know enough to have a good answer to any of it. And you're literally feeling fear because I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing and it's going to trigger this person right here. Do you not need to find a place in yourself of bravery and calm where you're leaning forward into what feels very scary and uncomfortable, but you're keeping your eyes open. You're not forcing an outcome. You're just trying to open and expand your consciousness so that you can really take in what the other person is giving you, not ready to counterpunch, but just to go, ah, I feel what you're feeling. I see what you are talking about. And it doesn't mean I'm going to graft that on and it's going to replace who I am here.
Yes,
But
exactly. That's really important. That's really important. Understanding and empathizing, being able to see it through their perspective does not mean that you have to abandon your own perspective.
and you can't. I've tried it, and I snap back. Within a day or so. I'm snapping back. Like, who is that? I don't believe that. That doesn't actually make total sense to me, given everything else I understand.
Exactly. And yes, but I do believe what you're saying is true. And I really believe that reconnecting in real life rather than online is where I think that's a really important part of it, because we've been connecting in real life and aligning in so many and noticing our alignment in real life for so many years. This online thing is an overlay, and it's intersecting with where we are in capitalism and all the other world structures in a way that's really pernicious. And I don't know of another technology, shall I say, a technology that could rival what we can accomplish by just being in a room together.
This is the natural superpower of human beings. There's a reason why empathy is an
Yeah.
advantage, an evolutionary advantage.
There's a lot of theories in psychology that say that the reason we even have consciousness is so that we could share ideas and tools and not have to just figure it all out in our own lifetime. When we think about competition, people do it in a biological sense of like my genes versus your genes and how we're going to make the next generation. That's actually a very wrong and limited view of what's happening here. What's happening is actually on a group level, on a species level. And that's the way to think about humans as one interconnected group. It makes much more sense to think about humans as a group than to think about humans individually.
Right. Because we are a herd species.
We are a herd species and we are social animals, which means that we survive in groups. We are not lone individuals.
Right. And
And
with that our technology that's been concocted through sharing information for thousands of years, we would all be very vulnerable to immediate
yeah,
death.
again, that's a cooperation that is right under the little thing of I shall go off and do my own thing and be, and no one can touch me and tell me what to do.
We all feel that sometimes. But but it's a beautiful fantasy.
Fantasy, because we all are together in our vastly different ideas of what's going on and what should go on, which we didn't have to talk to people who live 2,000 miles away in a different climate before, so we didn't have to
Right.
deal with all of that. Now we do.
But
So,
I feel like you're suggesting that consciousness is the genetic evolution. The edge of our genetic evolution is literally how we are sharing consciousness efficiently with each other so that
yeah,
we expand and grow and become even more accurate and sophisticated than we were in the last generation rather than less.
exactly. And that is literally how humans have evolved over time to become the dominant.
There we go. So dominance is achieved through cooperation. Exactly.
It's a
Yeah.
cooperation. You want to be dominant? We'll be cooperative. That's how you're going to get.
Yeah. You want to be in charge, be a great listener.
Exactly. We don't get rid of the other side. It's yin yang all the way. You don't get rid of the other.
And I think that's definitely the answer for our politically polarized times is that as painful and scary as it may sound, we really need to listen to the other side until we understand where they're coming from completely.